Welcome back to the Read and Rant podcast, where your host, Tony, who's me, sits down with books from every corner of publishing and gives them the one thing every book deserves, which is a fair shot. But tonight we're going to do something a little bit different because this isn't the rant table, this isn't Rant in Progress, and we're not going to hand down a final verdict. Tonight we're going to make a match. Alright? Welcome to the Rant Match. This is a segment where I take a traditionally published book, which is Kingdom of the Wicked, and put it across the table from an indie book that I think deserves to be in the same conversation. Not because they're identical, not because the one copied the other, and definitely not because I'm trying to tell you that one is objectively better. We're going to talk about reader crossover. If something about the traditional book caught your attention, I'm asking what indie book might scratch that same itch. And tonight's matchup is Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerry Maniscalco versus Rise of the Dragon Witch by Timothy Clark. Now this is why I created the Rant Match. Because on the surface, these are two very different books. But start digging into what attracts fantasy readers to them, and suddenly we have got something to talk about. So pull up a chair, bring your dang TBR, and somebody ring the damn bell, because it's time to embrace the rant, alright? We got round one. Why Kingdom of the Wicked, alright? This is the traditionally published side of the podcast. You know, Kingdom of the Wicked really brings us into a fantasy world built around witches, darkness, danger, mystery, supernatural forces, and a story that gradually opens the door into something much larger. And I think that's really important for tonight's match, because I'm not pairing these books based on identical plots. I'm matching them based on the fantasy reader they're capable of attracting. You know, I think readers that these books will attract are a reader who likes magic, who wants danger in a book, and who wants darkness lurking underneath the world. And the reader who enjoys discovering that the fantasy world they're entering is much bigger than it initially appears. And especially the reader who likes the feeling of, okay, what the hell is going on here? Because sometimes fantasy isn't about dumping the entire encyclopedia on you in chapter 1. Sometimes it's pulling back the curtain piece by piece. And that's tonight, that's where the indie challenger enters the arena. Enter Rise of the Dragon Witch. And we're going to cross over in indie fantasy with Rise of the Dragon Witch by Tim Clark. And if you've been following the Read and Rant podcast, you already know this book has been sitting in the rant stack. And I've been spending time with it, I've been tracking my reactions, and one of the reasons I wanted it for the rant match is simple. This is the type of indie fantasy that reminds me why this segment really needs to exist. Because there are readers walking into bookstores every single day looking for fantasy. They're checking the fantasy tables, they're watching Book Talk, they're scrolling Goodreads, they're looking at whatever title currently has the biggest marketing cane behind it. Meanwhile, indie fantasy is sitting over here saying, hey, we've got worlds over here too. We got magic and monsters and witches, oh my. We've got enormous conflicts, we got lore galore. We've got characters carrying the weight of entire worlds on their backs. And sometimes you just have to actually look for it. You actually have to physically go seek it out. Alright? So, people may be asking, why am I putting these two books together? Because I honestly think there's a particular fantasy reader who could potentially enjoy both. If Kingdom of the Wicked pulled you in because you enjoy supernatural fantasy, it's a match. If you like witches and magical forces really shaping the world, it's a match. If you like danger hanging over the characters, guess what? It's a freaking match. And if you enjoy uncovering a fantasy world rather than immediately understanding everything about it, you freaking guessed right, it's a match, okay? And if you're willing to leave the giant traditionally published fantasy aisle for a moment and see what independent fantasy authors are building, that is the biggest match of all. It's like the World Cup of matches, man, alright? But here's where the books kind of split. Because I don't want the rant match to become, these two books both have magic, so they're basically the same. No! That is lazy. The experience is totally different. Kingdom of the Wicked gives you its own blend of dark fantasy with mystery, supernatural intrigue, and romantic tension. Rise of the Dragon Witch is coming from a different corner of fantasy, and it offers its own world, lore, stakes, characters, and identity. Especially Finley with her witty, sarcastic humor. And Tim Clark has a really epic fantasy realism level of storytelling that is purely cinematic and awesome. However, I'm not saying if you like Kingdom of the Wicked, Rise of the Dragon Witch is basically the indie version. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if certain ingredients in Kingdom of the Wicked are what make you reach for fantasy in the first place, then Rise of the Dragon Witch might deserve a spot on your radar. Okay? That is the rant match. Alright? And I gotta address something and why indie belongs in these kinds of conversations. And honestly, this is where I'm gonna rant for a minute. Because I think we have developed this weird divide in the reading community. We got traditional books over here and indie books over there. Okay? Why? Because fantasy's fantasy, you know? A good story doesn't suddenly become less interesting because there isn't a massive publishing logo printed on the spine. And I'm not anti-trad publishing. Look at my shelves downstairs. Holy, I got 99% of my books are trad published books. I mean, I read plenty of them. I buy plenty of trad, published books. But I also think one of the biggest advantages readers have right now is that we have access to the best of both worlds. You could walk into a bookstore and grab a huge new fantasy release. Then you could go online here on BookTab and discover an independent author you never heard of and find an entire fantasy world waiting for you. Like Tim Clark or Ezekiel Eversand or J.D. Goland or R.W. McNabb, just to name a few, not to name drop, Elijah Stevanovich. You got all these incredible indie authors. It's incredible, And that's exactly what the Rant match is really supposed to celebrate. I'm not putting indie authors against traditionally published authors. No, I'm putting them beside them. Be friends, talk to each other. Because the question shouldn't always be, which one is better? No, sometimes the better question is, if I enjoy, this, if I can get my pointer to work, what else should I try? And that is where indie authors have a massive opportunity. So, here's who I think tonight's match is for. We got these guys up here. Okay, I suck with the hand signals, seriously. If you're a reader who really enjoys fantasy involving magic, supernatural elements, dangerous worlds, with mystery, escalating stakes, and discovering what's hiding underneath the surface, you already know Kingdom of the Wicked, or at the very least, you've probably seen it. But maybe you haven't seen Rise of the Dragon Witch sitting on the table at Barnes & Noble. Maybe Book Talk hasn't thrown it on your FYP 57 times, like all these recycled books are, Maybe you haven't seen thousands of Goodreads ratings telling you what you're supposed to think about it before you even open chapter 1. That's exactly why I'm putting it here. Because sometimes you need somebody to point at the indie shelf and say, hey, look over there too, dingy. Because these books in the indie section with the fantasy the fantasy genre, in my opinion, they're hitting so much harder than what they're pushing in trad right now. Not to mention trad publishing. I'm going to rant for a minute. Trad publishing is not publishing any new fantasy authors. They're only going with established authors because they're scared to lose money. Indie authors are not scared to lose money. They are not afraid to take risks. And let me tell you, those risks are worth some good payoffs. Because, man, I took some chances on some damn good indie authors, and I'm really glad I did. Because people like, Elijah Stevanovich, Tim Clark, J.D. Goland, R.W. McNabb, I think D.A. White, who else? E.D. Yates, Adam Fink, Jack Shukaitis. He writes sci-fi, but he's a cool dude. Just to name a few, You can't go wrong with people like those authors. They write amazing books. So, we got to ask ourselves, does tonight's rant match work? For me, hell to the yeah, it works. Not because these books tell the same story. No, they're far from it. They don't. And it's not because they're interchangeable. They're not. But because I can see a bridge between their audiences. And that's what earns the match. So if you read Carrie Maniscalco's The Wicked, A Kingdom of the Wicked, and you're looking to venture further into fantasy, especially into the indie side of the genre, you need to pick up Tim Clark's Rise of the Dragon Witch and put it on your TBR on your shelf right now. And while you're at it, you might as well buy Revenge of the Dragon Witch, because once you read page 1, you're not going to want to stop. He has a very cinematic, style of storytelling that, Finley's humor and wit really keeps the story moving from page 1. You don't have 200 pages of lore dump. No. And I think, too, you don't have to abandon traditionally published fantasy either. You don't have to become an indie-only reader. You don't have to choose a damn team. Just read more books, Because statistically, on average, the average American only reads one book a year. So let's read more. Let's promote literacy. Explore more authors. Take chances on stories that aren't already sitting underneath the giant spotlight. Because your next 5-star fantasy might not be sitting on the bestseller table. It might be sitting in an indie author's catalog waiting for somebody to give it a chance. Alright? And that is tonight's rant match. We have Kingdom of the Wicked by Carrie Maniscalco in one corner and Rise of the Dragon Witch by Timothy Clark. Alright? We got traditional fantasy meets independent fantasy. 2 different books. 2 different approaches. But enough shared DNA that I think readers of one should at least know the other exist. And that's what we're going to keep on doing here. We're taking the books everybody knows and introducing you to some of the books you should know. Alright? Because here at the Read It Rant podcast, the size of the publisher doesn't determine whether a book deserves a microphone. The story does. So until the next match, read it, review it, rant about it, and then always, embrace the rant! Read it and rant is out!